drugs, or ideas, what you consume influences who you become. On the Mind and Matter podcast, we learn together from the best scientists and thinkers alive today about how your mind-body reacts to what you feed it. Before starting Mind and Matter, I spent 10 years in academia doing scientific research. I got a PhD in neuroscience where I focused on neuroendocrinology and the neurobiology of behavior, and before that, I specialized in molecular, developmental, and evolutionary genetics. I use my scientific background to help parse and translate the information that guests share on the podcast. In addition to the podcast, I write long-form written content inspired by the show where I integrate what I've learned across episodes. I also have a free weekly newsletter where I provide you with upcoming guests, share links, and provide commentary on scientific studies and research that I'm reading, and more. Visit mindandmatter.substack.com to find all of my content. The full version of this episode is available to paid subscribers at the Mind and Matter Substack at mindandmatter.substack.com. The full version is also freely available on my YouTube page. Just look up Mind and Matter or my name, Nick Jikomes, on YouTube, and you'll find the episode there. This is a partial version of the episode, and so it'll cut off partway through, but you'll still get a significant portion. So sign up to become a paid subscriber at Substack or visit my YouTube page to get the full episode.
So my name is Ev, and I am a faculty member in the Brain and Cognitive Sciences department at MIT, and I'm also a member of the McGovern Institute for Brain Research, also at MIT, and I work on the language system in humans and trying to understand how it fits with all of the other stuff that we have in our minds and brains, so trying to kind of understand language in this broader landscape of the human mind.
And, briefly, how did you get into this? Why is this an area of particular interest for you?
Yeah, it's, somewhat accidentally, really. Like, I've always liked languages, but more from I always liked math as well. And I liked kind of I was learning a bunch of languages as a kid, and I liked seeing kind of the patterns and similarities and differences, different solutions to the same kinds of problems that different languages solve in different ways. And I didn't really know what to do with that. And I came to Harvard College as an undergrad, and then I saw that there's a class called Psychology of Language. It was taught by Professor Alfonso Karamazza, and I took this class, and it was just immediately obvious to me that this is what I'm gonna keep doing kind of forever, which is basically trying to use methods from psychology and cognitive science and neuroscience to try to understand how it is that humans understand and produce language, and are able to express the kind of, even the complexity of our thoughts and all that stuff. And so I got hooked then and then stuck with it.
Before you started studying language as an academic discipline, so where are you from and what languages do you actually speak?
Well, I grew up in Russia, so I was speaking Russian until, until I moved, I guess, to the US. That was my primary language, and I was learning English in school. I was in an English intensive school, and then I was additionally studying French and German and Spanish and Polish and a little bit of this and that, a few other things. But I think it was basically my mom's way to build a way to escape for me, because she knew that the country was flawed in various ways, and she saw some potential in me to pursue academic questions, or an academic career. And I think she just wanted to make sure that I have the tools, which of course, first and foremost, is being able to speak a language wherever you are, whatever it is that you're trying to escape to. And we were kind of covering broad ground with studying a lot of languages. But through that, I actually got really interested in the process of learning and processing language. So it kind of worked out in more than one way.
Mm-hmm. So one of the things that's very interesting about language is that it's simultaneously extremely familiar to pretty much everyone and also very mysterious at the same time. Yeah. We all use it. We all learn it effortlessly, seemingly, as children. And yet it's very mysterious where it comes from, how it arises, and really how it works, which is a lot of what we'll talk about today. So I'll just ask you a vague question, but what is language? How do you define it?
A very good question, and a hard question. So the way that I define language and the way that I think about it is basically a set of conventions that we as a society kind of agree on, not necessarily explicitly. There's a lot of implicit learning happening, but basically it's a set of conventions to refer to objects and actions and events in the world that we adopt as a group, and then we can use that code that we agree on to communicate about our internal mental states, right? What we feel, what we think, how the world works, right? We can teach each other things using this code, but also just express our, emotions and frustrations and beliefs and basically, communicate anything about our inner world and the outer world.
Mm-hmm. And then, another thing that's obvious, but often defies a systematic explanation for people is, so on the one hand, languages are very diverse, right? If you
Mm-hmm.
look at Russian or Chinese or Hindi, English, all
Yep.
of the languages you can think of, they use a different combination of sounds. They have a
Mm-hmm.
different
Mm-hmm.
structure to
Vocabulary.
them.
Yep.
The
Yep.
syntactical rules are different.
Right.
When you think about that diversity, and then you think about the fact that everyone speaks a language, the
That's right.
a common thought has been there's maybe something universal here that all languages share in common. Can you talk a little bit about the structure of language, maybe in terms of how a linguist would talk about it, and whether or not there truly are universals, and what those might be?
Yeah, another great question. I mean, so there are indeed a very large number of languages signed and spoken around the world. By current estimate, it's around 7,000, but a lot of languages are in the process of dying, which is sad. It's losing part of our, cultural heritage. And languages, indeed, it's one of the kind of communication system that manifests in very different ways across different groups. And for a long time, the notion that languages share something, all languages share something, was couched within this framework of universal grammar, this idea that's due to Noam Chomsky that we have some innate machinery that predisposes us to be able to acquire a system like language. There's not much support for this idea. In part, brought to the forefront by the success of large language models, where nothing is built in, like GPT-2, for example, right? Nothing is built in, and yet you can learn language just fine. Nevertheless, there are indeed certain properties that have been discovered in the experimental tradition and in corpus linguistics, where it seems like there are certain regularities that we find systematically across languages. Most of those regularities have to do, it appears, with communicative efficiency. So, for example, the ways that languages choose to use certain classes of sounds and certain combinations of sounds to convey meaning differences typically ensures that the different words in the language are distinguishable enough, but the sound complexity is not too high so that it's also possible to learn for a child learner. Similarly, how the kind of the conceptual space, our meaning space, how that gets carved up into lexical items, right? Like what do we choose to label with a word or construction in a language? That seems to also follow some very clearly predictable, even mathematically predictable
Hmm.
regularities between kind of the meaning complexity and how well meanings are differentiated from one
Hmm.
another. So how
Hmm.
much information they can convey in particular contexts. And there's regularities in the grammar as well. So for example, all languages tend to put words that are connected to each other in terms of meaning, like a noun and a verb, close by. And different languages do it in different ways. So the order in which those words come may differ across languages. But that tendency to try to kind of put things together that go together in terms of meaning, that seems to be present very much cross-linguistically, presumably driven by something like our memory constraints, right? It's hard
Hmm.
for us to keep track of information that spans long contexts. And so we try to package things into these locally kind of coherent sequences.
I see. So let me try and parse that. So obviously there's things that are sort of like trivially true across all languages. Obviously, we're all using sounds that we can
Yep.
classify as consonants and vowels in
Mm-hmm.
different ways. We're combining them in certain ways. There's some kind of syntax structure. It's obviously used for communication oftentimes. And we'll
Mm-hmm.
get into other things it might be used
Yep.
for elsewhere. But it sounds like what you're saying is so despite the fact that you have different languages that use different sets of sounds, right? There's phonemes or sounds that are present in English that are not present in Japanese and vice versa.
Mm-hmm.
All languages seem to share certain regularities whereby, um, so there's trade offs between how the sounds are combined and the diversity of stuff that can be communicated.
That's
And so
right.
languages all seem to be sort of optimized for combining sounds in a way that allows the language to be simple enough to be used and communicated to even small children,
Yeah.
and convey lots of information without getting too big and broad in what it's trying to communicate, and requiring too many different sounds to be put together all at
That's
once.
right. Yeah. And it's not just at the level of how sounds are combined to make up words, it's also in how words get combined into phrases and sentences. So
Mm-hmm.
those kind of regularities tend to span multiple levels of structure in a language. But yes, that's exactly right.
Mm-hmm. So even though different languages have different rules, syntax rules, so
Mm-hmm.
the subject and the object and the verb will be at different parts of the sentence,
That's right.
there are universal constraints, it seems, that have to do with how far apart those things are within sentences.
Exactly. 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 Yeah. Yep.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I want to talk a little bit about communication in humans as compared to other animals.
Mm-hmm.
Before we get into that exactly, is there a distinction that we should talk about between language and speech within humans?
Yeah, that's a useful distinction and I think helpful to highlight because a lot of people conflate those, including in the scientific literature. But basically, um, there are uh, perceptual aspects to language, right? So what you're hearing me right now, you're perceiving in your with your auditory regions the sounds that I'm producing. I could switch to a language that you don't speak, right? That's totally unfamiliar to you. And those auditory regions would still be doing the same work. It's still perceiving the speech sounds. The only difference will be that you can't get any meaning out of the signals, right? But you'll still do the acoustic processing. And so this separation that we can make conceptually between kind of the lower level acoustic processing of speech sounds and the deeper interpretation of the signals that can be conveyed through speech, as well as other modalities, right? Like sign languages rely on visual manual modality to communicate. Uh, this distinction seems to be instantiated in the neural mechanisms of how we process these signals. So like I was saying, you have these regions in the auditory cortex, which process speech sounds. They're very selective for speech sounds relative to other kinds of sounds. So those regions that will respond to English speech sounds or Tagalog speech sounds or Hindi speech sounds will not respond or respond much, much lower when you're listening to music or, hearing your dog bark or whatever. Um, but those regions in turn are distinct from the higher level, what we call kind of, higher level language processing regions, which are the regions that recognize words, recognize structures in the signals when we know the language and put them together to create complex meanings. And so that distinction between the lower level speech perception and the higher level language interpretation is an important one. It's both conceptually and it turns out empirically, that's how our system is set up with
Hmm.
those things being very separable.
I see. So there's an important distinction to be made between the production and the taking in of the speech sounds, the acoustic or auditory stimulus itself, versus the capacity to map those sounds onto meanings.
To meanings, exactly. That's exactly right. Yeah, so we didn't actually talk, I didn't say anything about production, but just like you have these auditory regions for speech perception, you have regions in your motor and premotor cortex that do the planning of speech patterns, right? And
Mm-hmm.
again, you can produce things that don't mean anything, right? I can say galaba, doesn't mean anything, right? But I
Mm-hmm.
can say it, and those mechanisms that implement speech movements will be engaged just as much as if I'm saying something meaningful.
Mm-hmm.
But the high level system, of course, cares deeply whether you're saying something that actually conveys a meaning versus just has similar formal
Hmm.
property.
And I suppose it's occurring to me that there are, I think there are probably neurological and psychiatric disruptions of the brain that can really sort of make this distinction jump out. So, for example, I'm thinking of people with certain brain lesions where they appear to be talking fluently, but it's all just sort of garbled
Meaning,
gibberish,
yeah.
or something like
Mhm.
schizophrenia, for example. You might observe someone who's speaking, they're using speech, they're producing words, but the logical structure doesn't carry a lot of meaning to it.
Yeah, schizophrenia is actually a little bit more complex. Schizophrenia, I think, affects an even higher level of thought that's somewhat
Mm,
independent of language. So even though it will, of course, those thought disruptions will manifest in language because that's
mm,
what we use to talk about, to talk about our internal mental states. But I think schizophrenia is better thought of as actually a disorder of thinking.
hmm,
Whereas aphasia, different kinds of aphasia may affect different pieces of the speech perception or production machinery, or this kind of higher level actual, knowledge representations that we use to do the mapping between forms, linguistic
Hmm.
forms.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think we'll get into later some more detail around distinctions and similarities between linguistic processing and thinking or other cognitive
Yeah.
operations.
Mm-hmm,
But I
mm-hmm.
want to come back to the communication piece of this and the sort of comparative zoology
Yes.
that's I think is interesting here.
Yeah.
So, how is human language different from other forms of sophisticated animal communication? I'm thinking here of things like the songs of songbirds
Yeah.
or whales and dolphins and things like that.
Yeah, there's still a lot we don't know about animal communication, and that's a very active area of research. As I'm glad that you said that the communication systems of other animals are sophisticated, and there's a lot of information that gets transmitted. For a long time, for example, vocalizations of chimpanzees, were thought to just be grunts until some researchers went and studied this more rigorously using kind of controlled experiments. Turns out they convey a lot of information with those grunts. They just sound like grunts to us,
Mm-hmm.
much like probably our speech sound not very intelligible to them, obviously. So that's just like one big point is I think there's a lot that we don't know yet. That said, there's obviously something different about human language. Um, how exactly it's different and what it is that we have that other animals don't have is a very big question. A lot of people have tried to construe language as kind of the golden ticket that gave humans all of the sophistication that we have as a species. I think that's not, I think that's a little misguided. I think there's many things that differ between us and other animals, including the sophistication of mental processes that have nothing to do with communicative abilities, that have just to do with how we represent the world and reason about the world.
Mm-hmm.
But obviously one thing that, given the richness of our knowledge structures and this communication system that we developed to communicate about those knowledge structures. One thing that language very unambiguously does is allows us to preserve knowledge and pass it along generations, right? So you don't
Mm.
need to start figuring out physics from scratch. You can just read a textbook and be like, okay, here's what we know about the physics of the world right now, or here's what we know about how humans work as social agents, or here's what we know about math, right? And you can build on this, and this building knowledge upon knowledge is a really powerful thing that obviously has led to the civilizations we've been able to build. But in terms of how exactly language differs from other communication systems, I think the bigger differences lie in the sophistication of thought, which is merely reflected in the sophistication of the communication system. Because of course, given the social species, at least like if we look at the primate species, right, we're all very social animals. And so it has to be the case that our communication system kind of reflects whatever it is that's on our minds, such that we want to connect with each other and build social structures. And so, of course, if we have more sophisticated thoughts, this will be reflected in the sophistication of the communicative signals that we use. But I think I think the differences between humans and other species are not reducible to something like language in some isolated way.
Mm-hmm. And so, what's implied here is that the language faculty is one thing, but there are other cognitive faculties at play that
Right.
don't necessarily depend on language or that don't arise from language.
That's
And
right.
that's certainly been an area of debate, I think, in this realm for a while. To what extent is our thought coming from our linguistic abilities, and
Yes.
to what
Yeah.
extent are linguistic abilities independent of, say, our ability to engage in advanced planning or complex social reasoning or
Decision
sort of
making.
abstract mathematical
That's right.
abilities? Where do you stand on that, and sort of what's like sort of the thinking in the field right now? Is that still controversial, or do you think we have a relatively clear answer?
Um, I mean, it's not controversial as far as I'm concerned, but people certainly will keep debating. I mean, it's a very interesting, it's a deep question that has been on the minds of many thinking people for many years.
Hmm.
But and of course, there's some people who are not so interested in data. Like in some philosophical traditions, it seems they seem to be disconnected enough from data, so it kind of almost doesn't matter what the data tell you. They
Hmm.
have their theories that they build based on kind of just some conceptual primitives alone or something. But empirically, there is, I think, now pretty compelling evidence that the language system is quite distinct from different systems that support thinking abilities. So it's not like we have one brain region that does thinking. There's a whole bunch of distributed large scale, what's called large scale distributed networks in the brain that do different forms of reasoning. And the kinds of evidence that exist for the separability of the language faculty from these other systems are basically evidence from brain imaging studies where you can show that different kinds of tasks selectively engage one or the other, and I can elaborate more on that, and evidence from individuals with brain damage. So you already alluded to kind of the information we can glean from studying cases of brain damage, where basically you find clear dissociations between damage to the ability to use language as opposed to damage to something like the ability to reason or plan. And both of these kinds of evidence have painted what I think is a pretty clear and consistent picture where we have the language system, we have a bunch of other systems that support reasoning, and they work largely independently. There's some open questions about how they co-develop, which is harder to study because we can't experiment with what kind of inputs kids get, right? And a lot of things happen in the first few years, so it's very hard to tackle those questions. But at least in the mature brain, those are very sharply distinct systems. Of course, they have to work together, but yeah.
Yeah, and so just to reiterate, there's longstanding questions here around, is the language faculty a largely or mostly standalone part of our cognitive toolkit that's largely or at least partially independent of other forms of thinking, versus to what extent do other forms of thinking, all other forms of thinking, maybe just some forms of thinking, depend on linguistic ability?
That's right.
What you seem to be saying is that the data is pointing to our linguistic abilities being largely more of a standalone thing, and this would mean that if we look at patients with lesions or disruptions to language in some way, that their other cognitive abilities are preserved. Can you give some examples of that?
Yeah. So effectively, so the most kind of informative and striking cases in this realm are cases of like really severe aphasia, where individuals basically get their whole language system wiped out, typically by a large stroke. And to the best of our knowledge so far, like every kinds of reasoning tasks that have been attempted with these patients, they can solve them just fine. They can do math. If they were able to play chess before, they'll continue to play chess. They can write music. Again, if they were a composer, they'll continue composing music. They can solve logic puzzles. They can do Sudoku, like any kind of, they can social reason about others' minds, like why might somebody behave in a certain way based on the beliefs that they have. Of course, all of these tasks have to be cast in a way that's you can convey the instructions and without words.
Right. I was going to ask that next.
Challenges too, but it's doable. But pretty much everything, all of these tasks, they do as well as control participants who have their language. In fact, they're often really excited to do these tasks because they've been inundated with all sorts of things that they can't do, right? Because, physiologists would test them on various aspects of language and they fail in all of those.
Yeah. But when you say these people have language deficits, is that in the ability to produce speech, or is it also like comprehension? Can they no longer
it's loss
read?
Of knowledge.
Yeah.
No. They cannot map any forms to meanings anymore. They lost that set of mappings, which is what I think the kind of human language system stores and uses to interpret others' utterances and encode our thoughts into utterances. They lose that whole system. So whatever you've been learning across your lifetime, right, about, okay, table means this and run means this, and that's how you put them together, you lose all of that. And so imagine just kind of like being in a country where you don't speak the language, suddenly you just don't have access to that code, right? But it turns out that their thinking proceeds okay. Like it looks as if
they can still do their taxes, they can still play board games.
Exactly.
Yeah. Interesting. So, a nice follow-up to that is simply when you have patients with those kinds of lesions where the deficits seem to be limited to the language faculty mostly or completely, what parts of the brain are involved there?
Yeah, so the language system is instantiated in a set of brain areas. They kind of span parts of the lateral frontal cortex and parts of the lateral temporal cortex. In most individuals, the language system lives in the left hemisphere. Not always true. In rare cases, it lives in the right hemisphere, and that seems to work okay as well. But It's this set of brain areas which surrounds it's sometimes called perisylvian cortex, because the sylvian fissure is this big kind of separation between the frontal cortex and the temporal cortex. Like if you take a brain in your hands, you can separate the temporal lobe quite, clearly.
Yeah,
And this
yeah.
line that separates that from the frontal lobe is called the sylvian fissure. And so perisylvian just means around the sylvian fissure. And there's a certain kind of stroke, certain kind of artery, middle cerebral artery, that supplies blood
That part of the
to this
brain.
part of the brain. Exactly. And so if you have a big stroke in that affecting that artery, you will often lose this kind of whole frontal temporal areas.
Hmm. Okay, so you can disrupt certain parts of the brain, and the phenotype you see, the problem that manifests is largely just a language deficit. Other things are preserved, so these people they can reason in other ways, as you said. They
Exactly.
don't have other motor deficits or basically anything.
Sometimes they'll have motor problems. I mean, but again, and of course, one thing that's important to remember when we talk about deficits is you will always have cases where multiple things are affected. Of course, there are individuals who have both language and cognition affected, and you'll have cases where language and motor control is affected.
Hmm. Hmm.
But most striking are cases where you see these dissociations. So
Hmm.
there's an old saying in the neuropsychology world, which is dissociation trumps association. Trumps now has bad connotations for other reasons, but dissociations are much more important. So when you see these cases where X is there and Y is not, or Y is there and X is not, that's really informative.
Yeah,
That
it
can
shows
tell
you
you
that
that
one isn't strictly necessary for the other.
exactly. Yep.
Whereas when two things co-occur, it's always
It's hard to
tricky
know
because it might be
exactly.
coincidence.
Yep,
Yeah.
yep, yep, yep. And
Interesting.
especially, and the reason that those coincidences happen quite a lot is because language is right next door to many other brain areas. And so, of course, like if you have a big lesion, you'll often have damage to a bunch of nearby functionally distinct bits.
Hmm. Hmm. And so 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 when we talk about a language deficit here, you were basically referring to the ability to map meaning, whatever exactly that means, to sensory stimuli. In this case, we're talking about speech sound, so it's an auditory stimulus. Obviously, there's no strict limitation here for it to be auditory because people can do sign language,
Read,
for
yeah.
example.
Or
But
read,
there,
yeah.
yeah,
Hmm.
but there's some process by which more abstract meanings are directly linked to these
Forms.
sensory features.
Yeah.
Can you unpack a little bit more about like what is going on there with that mapping and how it ties into, say, symbolic cognition more generally?
Yeah, that's a big question. So you're basically indirectly asking like what is meaning and like what does that mean for, that mapping to exist. So how meaning is represented in the minds and brains is one of the biggest puzzles that a lot of people are still working on. But what we do know based on the evidence that exists is that meanings are in some sense abstract, in a sense that you can get to those meanings through different routes, right? I can tell you something in language, but I can show you a snippet of a silent film and create complex mental structures in your mind, right? So you can get to these meaning representations by many different routes. And there's a lot of debates as to how much these meaning representations are tied to our sensory and motor experiences in the world. So these are the ideas that are referred to broadly as embodiment, embodied cognition. And I think there's a lot of evidence that you cannot reduce our meaning representations to sensory and motor experiences, in part based on data from individuals who have very drastically different experiences, like individuals who are born blind or
Mm-hmm.
individuals who are born without limbs and therefore have very different experiential kind of path through the world. And yet they seem to acquire meaning representations that are very similar to the ones that individuals who have access to perceptual and motor modalities get. But the questions of, how exactly these meanings are represented, is it, all kind of distributed vector-like representations like those that live in large language models? Is there some more structured models of the world that emerge from this somehow? I think that's likely, but again, a very active area of research. And now, like how those, one is like, how symbolic are those representations of thought, our structures of the world that we infer from our experiences in the world, including through language, and how those map onto linguistic forms remains an active area of research, but I don't think it's necessarily so different from kind of associations. In some sense, there's some association that you learn between, say, a string cat and some representation of catness, right? Of, fuzziness. I mean, there's a bunch of sensory features, but there's also something abstract enough so you can make inferences, such that if I tell you, okay, a dog is similar to a cat and dogs can get, this kind of disease, you can reason that cats probably can get that kind of disease too, based on their like biological similarity in some structure representation of the animal kingdom or something like that. But I don't know, maybe you have some more specific ways to couch this question of like
Well,
how.
I mean, it's yes and no. It's sort of a difficult area
Yeah.
to even talk about. But I have questions here around sort of the I know that there's longstanding questions around the abstractness of language. Are there truly abstract representations that are independent of more concrete sensory motor mappings and things like that in the world? It sounds like you're saying that at least to some extent, there do seem to be abstract mappings of meaning that are parts of these language networks. And part of the evidence for that is that functionally, it sounds like you're seeing similar encodings of meaning in people with very different sensory motor experiences,
Right.
either because they are missing limbs and things like this.
That's right. That's right. That's exactly right. Yeah. So I guess it's also a useful distinction to make. So there's the language, which is kind of the forms that map onto the meanings. And then there's distinction between kind of like concepts, right? Like what does cat mean or what does run mean? And then kind of even more abstract representations of structure in different domains, right? Like reasoning about the physical world, like how gravity affects things, how things kind of, objects collide and whatever. And as well as like social domains, like how people behave with respect to each other, like what inferences they make based on, each other's behaviors and things like that. And there's a few of these domains that seem to be in the brain drawing on partially dissociable structures. So in addition to kind of this broad arsenal of kind of concepts of individual entities and actions, there's also these structured representations we build of different domains based on our experiences in the world. And all of that is abstract, but somehow through the link between word forms and concepts, we're able to learn about these domains from each other and communicate about these kinds of knowledge representations with each other pretty effortlessly.
It's occurring to me too that something there's a relationship here too between the cognitive diversity you see among people and how you think about sort of the abstractness of language. And this is, I think, going to tie in actually to discussions we'll have around language for communication versus language for thought, and how language might reflect thoughts that don't themselves depend on linguistic faculties. But sort of what's in my mind right now is, I was just asking you about like how abstract is language, blah, blah, blah. And it occurs to me that the answer to that question in some sense depends on the individual that you're talking about. So for example, I might ask you, what did you eat for breakfast yesterday?
I don't know, I probably skipped it because
yeah. Okay. So let's say you ate scrambled eggs for breakfast and you remember that. That's a simple question. Anyone can answer it. Then I could ask you, well, how would you have felt if you had not eaten anything for breakfast? So now it's sort of like another layer of abstraction. Some people respond to that effortlessly and they imagine, oh, I probably would have been like irritable because I always need my morning breakfast or whatever. And some people really struggle to answer questions like that. And so, if you were to actually image the brain of both people, you'd probably see a different level of engagement or abstractness in terms of how they're mapping those meanings.
Perhaps, yeah. I mean, it's certainly the case that some people make much stronger and richer inferences based on the information that's present. That's certainly true. And oftentimes we use language to judge about abilities like that because that's the only thing that we can observe, right? I can't look at somebody and make a judgment about how smart they are and how they think, right? But I can ask them, and through that, I can kind of probe the sophistication of the mental structures, which is kind of the whole basis of the Turing test, right? The idea is that if you can use that interface to get access to the internal structures, you can kind of do, a bunch of controlled experiments as you wish, right? Like if, ask about this kind of bit of knowledge, does it have it or does it not have it? Does whatever system have it or not? If I ask you to make a few kind of reasoning steps in a particular domain, can you do it or not? But so language is a useful interface to probe the mental sophistication. But like I said, it doesn't seem that the medium of thinking is language itself.
hmm I want to talk a little bit more about the language network here in the neuroanatomy. So, if I'm hearing you correctly so far, there's not one discrete neuroanatomical locus of language in
Mm,
the brain where if you lesion that spot and language goes away, and it's not any other spot. But it does sound like there are multiple spots in this larger network which are
that's right.
anatomically localized to certain regions that are all coordinating with each other to give
That's
rise
right.
to the language faculty. You mentioned, roughly where some of those areas are. Can you talk a
Mhm.
little bit more about where these areas are and the extent to which they are functionally specialized for language versus the extent to which they're doing other things that get co-opted into the language faculty?
Right. Yeah. So, indeed, so I want to clarify a little bit that although it is absolutely true that language seems to be supported by this distributed network of areas, it does seem that there is one part of that network that is especially important, perhaps because it's kind of the first processing station when information comes in through the perceptual systems.
Mm-hmm.
But it's the posterior temporal cortex that seems to, when damaged, to lead to kind of longer lasting and more severe kinds of aphasia.
Yeah.
So, but you can also get aphasia by damaging other parts of that system. It just does seem that there's some privileged role that this region plays. But right, so one of the reasons that I kind of started using neuroscience approaches is I was interested in exactly this question. Like, language emerged pretty late in our species history, and so it would be very reasonable to kind of hypothesize that maybe when language emerged, it kind of co-opted bits and pieces of things that were already existing and kind of were used for similar kinds of
Mm-hmm.
things, right? Maybe, a little bit of auditory machinery, a little bit of kind of social reasoning because language is such a
Mm-hmm.
social tool, and a little bit of kind of abstract meaning representations or something like that. And so the modern brain imaging tools are very well suited for asking these kinds of questions because if you're a good experimentalist, you can design conditions that target a particular mental computation like language comprehension or mathematical reasoning or social perception and things like that. And so over the last bunch of years, almost decade, no more than like 15 years, we've been at it. We've evaluated a whole bunch of these kinds of hypotheses of language sharing machinery with other things. And I was fully expecting to find that at least some parts of the system would be shared with other domains. But it turns out, again, empirically, none of the regions that respond strongly when we do language, and by do language, I mean either produce or understand language, because the high-level language system gets engaged by both directions of mapping between forms and meanings. None of those regions respond when we do pretty much anything else,
Hmm.
from perceptual things like processing faces or spatial layouts to more cognitive things like doing math or doing reasoning, like social reasoning or doing logical reasoning or episodic memory or representing meanings that got to
Mm-hmm.
us through a different medium than language. Um, so it seems that the language system is really just this very specialized kind of store of these form meaning mappings, and everything else is separate and draws on distinct machinery.
Hmm. And so one of the things that's interesting here, so you've told us that you can lesion parts of the brain and you see deficits in language without seeing deficits in other cognitive abilities. People can still play chess. People can still socially reason. They can do other sophisticated things. So the
Mm-hmm.
language faculty does seem to be standalone to some significant degree.
Mm-hmm.
And where that sort of makes me think now is okay, if that's the case, if all of these other forms of cognition don't depend on language, then why did language evolve? And so this gets us to issues of what it's actually
Yeah.
for and why it was selected. And presumably it was strongly selected, although I guess I'm just making that assumption.
Yeah,
Um,
I assume so, yeah.
so if it wasn't selected for these other types of thinking or something like that,
Yeah.
what do we think it's actually being used for primarily?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's likely social functions like being able to pass knowledge to each other through communication, right? So, which, you can very clearly see how that can improve evolutionary fitness, right? Like if I tell you how to make a certain tool to protect yourself from predators or to, get better food or whatever, that's very helpful, as well as kind of just facilitating cooperation, right? A lot of things that humans did which were required for survival could not be done alone. So it required kind of people to work together to scavenge or hunt, to protect again from, other groups and so on, or other species. Language, of course, is very useful for coordinating action. It's a deeply embedded kind of social medium. So I suspect that it's some form of communicative use. What exactly it was, we may never know, because there's just no way to conclusively answer evolutionary questions. It's just tricky.
Mm-hmm.
Although I think with some of the recent AI advances, there's interesting modeling work that could potentially be used eventually to ask these kinds of questions, like under what conditions does a communicative system resembling language emerge? Like what kind of pressures need to exist in the environment to have this system come about? Yeah.
Yeah. And it's so, on the one hand, it's sort of trivial to say that language is about communication and communicating with each other. Like, of course it is. That's clearly one strong use case for it. But one of the things, but the question is it only used for communication and social purposes, or is it used for these other modes of thinking? You've told us that there's some indication that other modes of cognition don't depend on language. Is there anything in language, in the structure of how information is passed in the medium of language, that support that it's primarily for communicating between individuals rather than about engaging in other forms of cognition?
I mean, yeah, so there is the evidence that I talked about briefly, where like basically different features of natural languages seem to make them really well suited for efficient transfer of information. And that's not like a knockdown evolutionary argument, because people may say, well, there's all these cases of acceptation, maybe language evolved for thinking, but then it became used for communication, and so it evolved these different features over time or something like that. It's possible, but
it's also impossible to test that, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, it's exactly. It becomes kind of vacuous because it's hard to test. That's exactly right. But then again, in adults, I can measure your activity when you engage in various forms of reasoning, and your language regions are not doing anything when you're solving these different kinds of puzzles, engage in different kinds of thinking. And so that tells you that, well, at least in modern humans, the system is not doing thinking for you, because if it did, we would see evidence of that, and we just don't. So again, I try to typically stay away from evolutionary claims, but I can tell you for sure that in a modern brain of a modern human, in our species, we don't seem to be using the language system for any forms of thought that we've tested so far, which is a pretty extensive set. It seems like you can also damage the system, and reasoning can proceed just fine.
Mm-hmm. And one of the things that's really interesting about language is the language acquisition piece of this. So very young children pick up language spontaneously. They don't need to sit down in class and be instructed explicitly like they do for other subjects. It's a very natural thing to pick up at a very young age. And then layered on top of that is how difficult adults often find it to learn an additional language, even though they easily learn their first language as a child. What does that tell it? Like, so why is it that the child brain that isn't fully formed, and the child can't do a lot of things on their own, their cognition is not fully developed? What does that start to tell us about language here, that it can be learned so easily in a young brain that is otherwise not as sophisticated as the adult brain?
It's a good question. Again, lots of debates around this kind of host of questions. I should say that one thing I always say to my students when I teach about language and language in the brain is that it's a very bad experiment, in a sense. Like, it's a very unfair comparison between a child learning a language and an adult learning a language. The experiences are completely different. When you're a child, you have caregivers around you whenever you're awake, and like you are their main focus of attention for the first like
Right,
two
right.
years for sure, right? They're around you, they're trying to interact with you, they find you like the most exciting thing in the world. It's great, right? It's good times, childhood, early childhood. And then when you're trying to learn a language later, it's a very different experience. One, you've already learned a ton about the world, so there's no kind of pressure to like find a way to, figure out what the world is like and talk about it. You already know everything about the world, and you're just trying to learn this other set of mappings between forms and meanings that you already know. But of course, the learning mechanisms change. There's certain kind of plasticity that's present early on that we know is not present later on, as kind of knowledge structures come into place, which happens very rapidly during the first few years of life, right? We learn a ton. Like a 5-year-old is a very sophisticated, mental system. So a lot of these kinds of plasticity windows do become, not as accessible at later ages. But why exactly it is, I don't think anybody has an answer to that. But there's interesting work on people trying to reopen the windows of plasticity and learning using like things like psilocybin and whatever. There's interesting work that I think may tell us more about what kinds of learning may be possible even in an adult brain under different conditions. But I think it's a very hard comparison to make between an infant learning their first language and an adult learning a second or third or whatever language.
I think it's an important point because it's really easy to say infants or young children learn language easily. I don't necessarily think we can quite say that. If you ever watch an infant, they often seem to be quite angry and struggling to communicate.
Yes.
It's very intensive, but basically what you're saying is it's an apples and oranges comparison. And I wonder so when we say, obviously it takes longer for most adults to learn a language if they try to, but the question is, are they really in an environment where they have to try as hard as a child?
Exactly right.
Is there
Yes.
any data out there where an adult is truly fully immersed and they can't use their native language? And how long does it take to learn?
I mean, again, I don't think the right experiments have been done. You want to like match everything else and
Yeah,
just vary the way you learn. But of course, there's still a lot of things that will vary if you're immersed without
right.
any access to your knowledge. So
Yeah,
it's very hard to do these
it's not
controlled
feasible.
kind
Yeah.
of kinds of studies. But from what like second language teachers will tell you, yeah, immersion is definitely helpful. Like if there is more of a need for you to survive in a group of people who you have to somehow interact with,
hmm
of course you're going to be more motivated and whatever. But you know, what exactly is happening that's changing in those circumstances, I don't think
hmm
we know. Um,
So some of the things you've told us so far are that, one, there does seem to be this standalone-ish language faculty that you can find in the brain that is dedicated largely to language, not
yep.
other forms of cognition. There is a language network in the brain. There are parts of the brain, different parts that are interconnected that seem to be largely dedicated to linguistic processing.
Yep.
And I want you to unpack that in the context of something else you said earlier, which is if you go back to the ideas of Chomsky around universal grammar, the
Mm-hmm.
stuff that you often learn, I remember learning this in psychology and neuroscience
Mm-hmm.
classes. This is one of the dominant ideas or big ideas that's been there historically, that humans have this innate language faculty, and there's this sort of template in our brains that we all have.
Yeah.
How do you think about, so on the one hand, you're saying there is a standalone language faculty, there are parts of the brain dedicated to this, but also that universal grammar, that general idea doesn't have a lot of support. Can you
That's
unpack that a
right.
little bit for me?
Yes, of course. Yeah, yeah. No, those are great questions. So this question ties into a question of how does a language system come to be? And
hmm
the way that I've talked about it as kind of a set of form meaning mappings that we can use to encode thoughts into word sequences and decode meanings from other word sequences, already should tell you that it can't be innate, right? Because we have to learn those mappings. When I am born into the world, I don't know anything about what words may mean. I don't know anything about the
hmm
world, right? Well, that's debated, but let's say for simplicity, let's say we know nothing. And if I'm placed in a Japanese family, I will learn Japanese. And if I'm
hmm
placed in a, family in the Philippines, I'll learn Tagalog or whatever. And so it's a very deep and interesting question of how these regions come to be language specialized regions. And the way to, of course, ask these questions is through developmental work. So you can ask, if I scan a 5-year-old, do they have a language network? Turns out they do. If you scan a 4-year-old, they do too. And to 3-year-old, yeah, it seems to be already there, which of course makes sense because a 3-year-old can in pretty sophisticated ways communicate already using language. Now, the most action in language learning happens between about 6 months of age when kids start learning to map words to meanings. The first evidence is around age 6 months, and about 1.5 years of age. Like that's where kind of the most intensive change happens. Now, that's a window during which studying brains of children is really, really challenging.
Yeah.
We can actually scan infants like in the first couple months of life. They're just mostly sleeping, and you can study auditory processing even during sleep, which is what a lot of people do. And then you can scan them using tools like functional MRI from about 2.5, 3 years of age. 2.5 is very challenging. I have a postdoc currently doing this, and it's a lot of very, very hard work. But like at around 9 months or 1, what these regions are doing is a very, very important question, because I think this can tell us something like, what is language made out of? Like what are the circuits that become language circuits? To the extent that we find these regions, say in a 3-year-old, what are they doing when that kid is 1? Are they responding to general kind of social stimuli? Are they responding to kind of abstract representations of meanings in the world? Are they responding to some kind of more abstract reasoning challenges, right? We're trying to see if we can make some headway on those questions by using some combination of longitudinal scanning, of like scanning infants and then scanning them later when they have the language regions, as well as scanning during this toddlerhood period to see if language regions respond to other things earlier on and later become more specialized. But we don't have an answer yet. There is some work from Zeynep Sagan's group at Ohio showing that at least like by age 3 or 4, the language system seems pretty specialized. So, there is that bit of evidence. But again, what's happening earlier, nobody knows yet. But yeah, and a lot of like a question that often follows this line of questioning is like, well, why does it always end up in the same place?
Yes,
and the answer to that is, right, like if it's an acquired system, if it develops through experience, why is it always there? And the answer likely lies in connectivity patterns. Like it has to be connected to things where the information comes in and where it has to go out in the speech production realm.
And I mean, I would imagine too, just experientially, everyone's experience is unique, but actually they're mostly, for most people, quite similar, right? We're all using an auditory mapping, except for the small number of people that are auditorily impaired. And I would imagine the network does shift somewhat in those individuals.
Yeah. Well, so sign language, the high level processing appears to be preserved, which is kind of cool. It seems that system of 4 meaning mappings is very abstract. Like it doesn't matter what modality it's used. Of course, the perceptual mechanisms are going to be in a different place, right? It's going to be in the visual cortex because that's the part of the brain used to get the initial information out of the signals.
I see. So there could be something here to do with connectivity that is independent of sensory modality, which would speak to why some of these regions you would point to on a brain map here are not in like a primary sensory area. They're in these in-between areas that can connect to any sensory modality.
That's exactly right. Yep.
What, I can anticipate your answer to this, I think, based on what you've told me so far. But, if we go back to this question of to what extent are language and thought dissociable, or certain other cognitive functions dependent on language, or, synergizing with language to some extent, there's this famous idea in neurolinguistics and psychology called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which basically says that the language you learn constrains your cognition in very important ways. What do you think about that hypothesis and how it fits with what you've told us so far?
It's a very interesting idea, and I liked that idea because as a bilingual speaker, I kind of know the intuitions that people build on, but unfortunately, there's just no evidence that supports these kinds of effects. So people have made empirical claims based on certain phenomena that, for example, if you have multiple words for a particular part of the color spectrum, you're better at differentiating those colors. Or if you have a way to encode certain aspects of motion in particular kinds of events, you may be better at remembering those aspects of events. And most of these studies just don't seem to be robust to kind of scrutiny and replication. In fact, for almost any empirical claim that has been made in that space, there is now a few other papers that will say, okay, it's a failure to replicate. It doesn't seem like there's robust evidential support for this. That said, there is something very true to the idea that the cultural needs shape the language, the kinds of things that we talk about, right? So this idea of, 100 words for snow, there is something to that. Of course, if our environment is such that it's important for us to distinguish between these kinds of things, of course, we'll come up with more words to cover that part of the conceptual space. But it doesn't have to be cross-linguistic and cross-cultural. It could be also witnessed within a society, right? Like if you are a podcaster and you need to know a lot about like the auditory recording machinery, right? You'll have all these terms in your vocabulary that most people may not know, but it's important to you and your work. And so you'll expand that part of your conceptual space. And of course, you'll learn words for how to refer to those things. So some of that, in some sense, has to be true. But this idea that, a particular language that you speak fundamentally reshapes your perception and cognition, I just don't think there's evidential support for it.
I see. So it sounds like the common denominator here is that people's vocabularies and the types of words they use in their language will reflect the social and cultural needs of the culture they're born into, but that does not translate into opening up the possibility for some more domain general ability that isn't opened up by learning a different language.
Exactly. That's absolutely right.
I see. The other piece that's interesting here that I want to touch on a little bit more. So we talked about this language network. We talked about some of the anatomy here. And then we also briefly mentioned the lateralization component of this, that typically this language network is largely lateralized to one half of the brain rather than the other. Usually it's left hemisphere, but it can be the right also in some people. Why would this lateralization happen? Why isn't it both sides? Do we have an explanation for why things would be localized to one hemisphere?
So I don't think we have an answer to that, which is surprising because it's such a fundamental fact about language. So there's certainly reasons, computational and metabolic reasons for why you might want to have a system within a hemisphere as opposed to straddling both hemispheres. That is, you can have faster information transfer between, say, frontal and temporal lobes within a hemisphere using the within hemispheric tracts compared to having to go through the interhemispheric connections to the other hemisphere. So that's a general kind of argument for why you might have lateralization of function. Why it's in the left as opposed to the right, I don't think we have a clear answer to. There's a lot of people working on this. There's stories, right? I mean, you say, oh, well, most people are right-hand dominant, and maybe somehow from the, early use of the right hand for kind of manipulation, tool manipulation, things like that, that somehow shifts the language, but it's very speculative. Moreover, if you actually remember how we talked about the high-level language system being separable from like the low-level perceptual speech regions and speech production, also like articulation regions. If you look at the lateralization of those earlier functions, they seem to be less lateralized than the higher level language system. So that makes it very hard. Like they're much more bilaterally present. Like your speech cortexes, it does show a small bias, but it's much more bilateral compared to the language system, which is very, very heavily biased to the left. So that makes it really hard to say like, oh, some early sound perception bias or motor production bias shifted that system, because if they're not even as strongly lateralized, it just kind of the pieces don't fall together into a coherent story yet. But it's a very important thing to solve, because one thing that you see in many brain disorders, including even ones that don't specifically have to do with language, is that the language system manifests more bilaterally. So, for example, in individuals with autism, and individuals with schizophrenia, and individuals with just epilepsy, like any kind of brain disorder you take, you see this more bilateral manifestation. So something is obviously going differently in cases where the brain is not quite working in a typical way that leads to this manifestation. And so it's really, really important to try to understand, why does it go to the left in most common typical individuals, and what's the functional importance of that, and why does it lead to problems if it doesn't happen this way. We're working on this. A lot of other groups are working on this, so maybe there'll be answers in the next bunch of years.
Yeah, so we don't know, but it does happen reliably. This lateralization, it's very interesting. It presumably is happening for some reason. It sounds like one idea could be that it has to do with things like computational processing speed, maybe because I have to parse so many things on a scale of seconds. In terms of making my speech, hearing what you're saying, understanding the context, all this, perhaps adding the latency that would come from plugging one side of the brain into the other just makes it much less efficient to do that or something.
That's right. But that's, again, just a bias for having a within hemisphere system as opposed to bilateral, and not for left versus right. Because you could, make the same arguments for, so it could have been like maybe in half of the individuals it would end up on the left and in half on the right. It's like a random little choice point, but yet it always goes to the left, almost always goes to the left. So something is special about the left hemisphere for.
Interesting. And so when people learn multiple languages, so like yourself, if we put you in a brain scanner, to what extent would each language light up the same language network in exactly the same way versus be sort of using at least somewhat different chunks of the brain?
It's the same system. We've done this now with individuals who speak multiple languages, up to 50 languages. We haven't tested them in all their 50 languages, but we've tested them in a bunch, and they all go to the same system. Now, of course, there has to be some differentiation at a finer scale, but it's not the case. Like, you don't find kind of coarse differences. Like, let's say, your French region is the left frontal one and your English one is the left temporal. The whole system gets engaged in the processing of all these different languages. You can use something like fine-grained activation patterns to reliably discriminate which language you're listening to. So I can take your brain when you listen to a bunch of English sentences and say French sentences if you're English-French bilingual, and I can reliably classify which language you're listening to from this fine-grained patterns of activation. Other ways in which there are differences is in how strongly that system is working when you're processing these languages. And there, it's basically two big factors that matter. One is how well you can understand the language. So the more you can understand, the higher the response. Which, again, an example I often use when I teach language acquisition is there's this old cartoon from the New Yorker about a man talking to a doggy, Ginger, and he gives her all these sophisticated sentences like, Ginger, you've done this thing again. I told you so many times. Well, Ginger, why are you doing this? And then in the dog's thought bubble, it's like, Ginger, blah, 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 Ginger, right? So the only thing that the dog can get from that is that single word, which is her name. And similarly, when you're learning a new language, and I give you information in that language, you may be able to kind of grasp little bits and pieces of language, but you can't quite put it together into a structured, complex representation. And so basically, the level of response in the language areas scales such that the more you can understand the language, the stronger the response, except for your native language, which is a little bit lower than you would expect based on the proficiency alone. So if I take, for me, right, well, I'm not a good example. I'm actually, I don't show this effect, but for somebody who is similarly proficient in two languages, and one language is their native language, one is non-native, you sometimes see a little bit of a low response to the native language, presumably because it's a little bit less effortful. I'm like a heritage speaker, what they call, I don't use Russian pretty much at all anymore. And so for me, we see similar levels of response to English and Russian.
So one of the things I want to ask you about too, it relates to this idea that language is primarily about communication. When you compare the word or symbolic systems for language compared to other symbolic systems that people construct, like math and algebra and stuff like that, one of the differences that jumps out is, when we do mathematics, the symbols are extremely, extremely precise. That's sort of the whole point of when we do mathematics. We're being extremely, extremely precise with these abstract symbols. But with language, there's lots of redundancy and ambiguity. The same word can often have different meanings when it's used in different contexts. Can you talk a little bit about the information processing there, in the sense of whether that sort of slop that's part of language is actually a feature rather than a bug when it comes to communication?
That's a very interesting hypothesis. I have not quite heard this hypothesis articulated in recent years for the key difference between between like natural languages and systems like math. Um, I mean, uh, I don't know whether uh, okay, so one way that you could test this is I guess there is a lot of um, meanings in language, a lot of words that do convey very precise meanings. Like it's not like language isn't capable of doing this. It's
Yeah,
true that
yeah.
there's still probably more ambiguity, but so you could imagine looking at the responses to words that convey precise meanings versus not. It's all going to happen within the language system, but we do have some evidence that the language system cares about more abstract meanings, but that's not quite the same dimension. I mean, so we in a recent line of work, we actually wonder like what are the features of language that make it do different things than like a system like math or programming languages, both of which load on a different system in the brain. And we examined the case of constructed languages like Esperanto and Klingon,
Hmm.
which share some features with like programming languages. On the one hand, they're like artificially constructed, they're very evolutionary recent. They're typically made by a single person, right? Like designing that
Yeah,
system.
yeah.
Um, and we looked at whether constructed languages would pattern with kind of programming languages or with natural languages, and they pattern with natural languages.
Hmm.
And we made an argument that this is because of the kinds of meanings that are conveyed, but not along the dimension you mentioned, which is like the level of precision of what meanings they pick out, but more in terms of um, uh, the fact that the natural languages typically convey meanings about the kind of the inner and outer world, right? We refer to objects, to entities, to actions, whereas math and programming languages convey a large range of meanings, but it's all kind of relational meanings. Like it's kind of like an internally very restricted system. It's very abstract kind of relations that those systems, formal systems, can express. And so that's kind of the story that we told, but it may very well be the case that kind of the precision with which these forms pick out their meanings plays into this as well. There should be ways to empirically distinguish those possibilities, including perhaps with like constructed languages that vary on that dimension. That's a very interesting idea.
Hmm. Yeah, and I guess, another sort of related piece there that I was thinking of was um is there some tie in here with like learnability? So the fact that, obviously, when you talk to a linguist, they'll often say things like, well, they'll talk about things like recursion, and you can make a sentence that's arbitrarily long and whatever. But of course, obviously, we don't learn an infinite list of words and
That's
meanings and
right.
things. It's ultimately finite. Is there something here to do with learnability, whereby, the fact that there's lots of redundancy, a fair amount of redundancy in language, that there's different words can mean different things, different contexts, does that actually help it be more learnable faster, than it otherwise would
Very
be if we had to
likely.
add words or something?
Yeah, very likely. So there is evidence suggesting that it actually is very helpful. So reusing forms. So in fact, Chomsky and a few others have made this argument, well, if language was for communication, it wouldn't have ambiguity in it. And you can
Mm.
mathematically show that it's actually really useful for a system to have ambiguity because it allows you to reuse forms that are, short and easy or whatever, have other properties that are useful for other things like learning or ease of production and something like that. So it's actually, and because exactly for the reason you say that context will typically disambiguate, it's not like we're confused all the time when we use language. Of course, occasionally that may happen, but it's very uncommon actually. And so reuse of forms to mean different things in different contexts is actually quite useful for an efficient communication system.
Hmm. And I want to go back to this distinction between language and thought, and ask you, and actually like come at this from something that you mentioned briefly. And I didn't plan for this, but I thought it was really interesting when you brought it up. Um, I brought up schizophrenia, and you
Mhm.
mentioned that you thought that was a disruption, not of the language faculty per se, but of thought at a different
Yeah.
level. Can you unpack that a little bit more for me?
Yeah, so I mean, schizophrenia is, construed by many as a thought disorder.
Hmm.
So, and it's a very interesting condition. I mean, it's a very, devastating condition, but it's very interesting in that it manifests, it has similar manifestations across very different cultures. Like there are certain
Hmm.
themes in the kinds of thoughts that people get which take slightly different forms, but they all have many shared features, like, somebody controlling you, right? Like you not losing being this ability to be an autonomous agent, or these kind of conspiracy theories, right? Where somebody has orchestrated a bunch of very sophisticated kind of, causal chains that lead to certain outcomes and so on and so forth.
Full version of this episode is available to paid subscribers at the Mind and Matter Substack at mindandmatter.substack.com. The full version is also freely available on my YouTube page. Just look up Mind and Matter or my name, Nick Jikomes, on YouTube, and you'll find the episode there. This is a partial version of the episode, and so it'll cut off partway through, but you'll still get a significant portion. So sign up to become a paid subscriber at Substack or visit my YouTube page to get the full episode. Hey everyone, I want to take just a minute to tell you about a really cool health monitoring device I've been using called Lumen. It's a handheld, pocket-sized device with a sleek design. The Lumen device measures CO2 levels in your breath, which allows their technology to determine the extent to which your body is burning fats versus carbohydrates. Lumen helps improve your metabolic flexibility, your body's efficiency in shifting between using fats and carbs for energy. I use this device in the morning, or before bed, or after meals, or after workouts to track my metabolism. With just a couple weeks of use, I learned a lot about which foods were causing my body to burn mostly fat, mostly carbs, or both, as well as how long I needed to fast and how hard I needed to exercise to promote fat burning. Being able to track whether your body is burning fat versus carbs will help you figure out how your body responds to your lifestyle and whether or not your weight loss and fitness strategies are actually working. Lumen is great for anyone looking to optimize their health for either weight loss or athletic performance. Their easy-to-use app allows you to track your results together with what you're eating and how you're exercising, and it syncs with other devices like the Apple Watch. Click the link in the episode description to learn more and use the code MINDMATTER, MINDMATTER, to get 10% off your Lumen device today. That's on top of the site-wide sale they are currently running, and the Lumen device is eligible to be paid for with FSA and HSA health accounts. Check out the link in the episode description for more info. This episode is supported in part by Athletic Greens. Their main product, AG1, is a comprehensive and convenient daily nutrition product containing 75 vitamins, minerals, and whole food sourced ingredients with less than 1 gram of sugar per serving, no nasty chemicals or artificial anything. It's gluten and dairy free and compatible with paleo, vegan, vegetarian, and ketogenic diets. AG1 is a quick and convenient way to supplement your diet to help ensure your body is getting the nutrients it needs. It comes in powder form, and you can mix it in water and drink it, or you can put it into a smoothie or a shake or something like that. I mix it into water and drink it, and it's super convenient. If you go to athleticgreens.com/mindandmatter, Athletic Greens will give you a free 1-year supply of vitamin D and 5 free travel packs with your first purchase. Their vitamin D product comes in tincture form, so you just take 1 drop each day. A large fraction of the population is actually vitamin D deficient, especially in winter months when we get less sun exposure. And vitamin D is super important for the proper function of the immune system and for a variety of other things. So visit athleticgreens.com/mindandmatter or click the link in the episode description. You'll get a free 1-year supply of vitamin D with your first purchase.